I would just like to start, if I may, by playing a clip from an interview I did in February with the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, on the backlog. Please have a listen.
Of course, you're responsible for our NHS, and you will know how many people are now waiting over a year for an operation or treatment. It's 224,000. A year ago, it was 1,600.
Yeah.
How will you bring those waiting lists down? When will it be
Yes.
back to 1,600?
Well, I hope it'll go back below 1,600 because before the pandemic, we were on track to get it to zero, which is where I'd like to see it. The number of people waiting over 12 months, it has gone up inevitably as a consequence of the pandemic. We've been putting more money into the NHS to make sure that they can not just deal with the pandemic, but also deal with this backlog. Obviously, a lot of that had to be paused during this second peak. And it's critical that the staff in the NHS get some R&R as well, because they've had a really tough winter so far. There's still almost 20,000 people in hospital with COVID. But then we are going to have to absolutely get through this backlog. So that's a big part of the agenda for the rest of 2021. It's another reason to be cautious on the steps out of lockdown, so that the NHS can get back to making sure people get prompt treatment.
So he said that he wanted to eliminate NHS waiting times for those people waiting for more than 12 months. How long, in your view, will it take to get the figures back down to pre-COVID levels?
I think a long time. I don't know anybody who's absolutely got the right figure. Interestingly, the Health Foundation thinks it might be 6 years. Some other modelers thinks it might be 4 years. It's going to be a long time. It's a massive number of patients. And I have to say, I feel rather regretful that most of the times I've been asked to speak to you and your colleagues, it is once more another record wait list. That's been going on since last July when I became president. Now 4.7 million, 400,000 waiting more than 52 weeks. It is a massive, massive backlog, and there needs to be a very special national effort to do something about it.
How do you get the figures back down? How practically, what do you need to get those waiting figures back down?
Well, part of the problem is that we've been having winter pressures for the last 2 or 3 years, even before the pandemic. So, for example, in 2018, there was a pause for 2 months for elective surgery. The 18-week target of 92% of the patients being treated within those 18 weeks was introduced by the Blair government and hasn't been met since 2016. So there is a structural problem. There is a structural problem around beds. There's a structural problem around the numbers of staff. There's a structural problem around the numbers of operating theatres and the capacity for the health service to deal with the backlog. I think even if we got back to business as usual, and it looks as though by July, we might get around 85, 90%. And by the autumn, we might get back to 100%. Though, of course, there might be a third wave or surge of the virus. I think even then, that's only going to keep the existing numbers of patients being put on the waiting list seen at the other end as a pipeline, a bit like a bath. The bath is filling up, water isn't going out of the plug fast enough, so the bath keeps filling up. And you know, we have this idea that maybe there are 3 or 4 million patients waiting who've as yet not been diagnosed. Some cancer patients, some patients with orthopedic problems, ENT problems, and so on. Some of those maybe have been scared coming up to hospital. So there's this idea of a bounce back too. So if you take all those things together, it's a monumental task.
Are you prepared for it, or you need more staff?
I think surgeons are a pretty optimistic bunch mostly, and they are now our members and fellows are looking forward to getting back to getting surgery going again. Many of my colleagues have had operating lists offered them once more for the first time for some things for 6 to 12 months. So there's a great sense of relief that at last we're getting things going. But I think we can't really, just with our existing arrangements, make much impact. I think even with evening working, even with weekend working, and the appropriate arrangements around that for pay and so forth, I think we'll still struggle to make an impact. So I think there needs to be a bigger rearrangement. We in the College of Surgeons have asked for a new deal for surgery. And that means increasing hospital beds, access to theatres, maintaining the independent sector capacity, which has been controversial. But for the next 2 or 3 years, we'll need to use some of those independent sector beds in order to be able to get extra capacity. I think we are very much in favour of the idea of surgical hubs. You know, one of the problems during the COVID surges has been that surgical facilities have been cannibalized to make room for, very reasonably, emergency medical patients coming to hospital. In those special geographical situations where the surgical facility was separate from the main acute hospital facility, they've managed to keep going. So, for example, in the middle of London for cancer, the Royal Marsden kept going cancer surgery because it wasn't an acute general hospital. In Croydon, south of London, they managed to cut the hospital in half, as it were. In Oxford, where I work, the acute hospital and the planned surgery sites are a mile apart. So they have been a special, if you like, COVID light or green site kept separate from the acute medical emergencies. So that needs to actually happen in as many places as possible around the country, because in that way we'll have some ring fence beds, which then can't be quite so easily accessed when the medical surges return. I think this winter, even if it's just flu, rather than COVID, we're going to have some troubles once more because we just don't have the capacity.
When you make that point to Matt Hancock, as I'm sure you do, as a big and significant lobbying body, what response do you get from him?
I think the response is yes, we know about it. Yes, we're going to do something about it. Of course, what we don't really understand is what goes on behind the scenes with the discussions with the Treasury. And I think those are often very tough. I mean, the country is facing a massive economic challenge. It's our job as surgeons to lobby on behalf of all those hundreds of thousands of patients waiting. And I think we're going to carry on doing that. I'm not quite sure how effective we are in the short term, but I can assure you in the longer term, we're going to keep keeping in the public eye the cause of all those patients still waiting for their hip and knee operations, for example, in pain on strong painkillers, losing their mobility, maybe losing their jobs, patients with ENT problems, children who need a cochlear implant, children who need cleft lip and palate surgery, all those kinds of time-dependent operations which often aren't seen to be absolutely essential. They're not, if you like, life-saving, but they're life-changing. And I think we've too often thought of some operations as just routine, so they don't matter. To the person who's having them, they're really, really important. And they're what I call the little miracles of surgery. Here we have at our disposal procedures we can give to patients which are completely life-changing, and we can't do it because there isn't the capacity. I think that's terrible.
Let's talk a little bit more about the effect of those record waiting times. Do they mean that some people could die or be at risk of permanent disability as a result of waiting? What's the practical impact of those long waits?
I think, first of all, it's important to say that most of the cancer surgery, for example, where if long delays would have an effect on outcome and maybe worse survival figures, most of that cancer surgery is being carried on. We're concerned that with the delays in presentation and diagnosis, there will be a group of cancer patients, for example, who will have more advanced tumours, which will be more difficult to remove, which will take longer to recover from, and which may have adverse outcomes. So that's on one side of the scale. On the other side of the scale is the much more difficult to measure harm that's done to patients who have, say, a bad hip. The bad hip gets worse and worse and worse, and it puts pressure on the spine and on the knee, and those then begin to deteriorate too. And then, as I have colleagues whose wives have, for example, had or husbands have had a wait list for a hip operation, they're now in a wheelchair. I mean, that is absolutely terrible. We have at our disposal the means to prevent people having that kind of disability. You've heard lots of stories, as I have, of patients having to take very strong painkillers. Trying to sleep at night with a really bad hip or knee is really, really tough. You lose sleep, you lose quality of life, you take strong painkillers, those have side effects, and on it goes. So we really need to do something about it for all those patients.
Thank you. That was a really clear explanation of how it impacts on people having to wait. I wanted to just ask you about COVID now. I wanted to ask you what hospitals look like today and the demographic profile of those in hospital today as opposed to at the start of the pandemic, whether we see now demographic changes.
Are you asking about patients actually with COVID
with
in
COVID,
hospital?
yes, with
Yeah.
COVID in hospital.
Well, of course, I obviously speak for the surgical community, which is, if you like, slightly separate from the challenges of COVID, although during the acute COVID crisis, many of my surgical colleagues were working in ITU doing proning, for example, helping putting in lines in patients where there was no venous access, and carrying on with all the emergency surgery. The numbers of patients in our hospitals now has dramatically declined, and that's why now operating lists and facilities are being released for the more, I'm not using the term lightly again, the more routine operations, which of course aren't routine for those individual patients. So the change in the numbers of patients actually being admitted, the numbers of patients on the ward, the number of patients in critical care has made a fantastic difference now to our ability to begin to restore planned surgery. So it's a huge change, and there is an enormous sense of relief. And the many meetings that I've been to in the last few months, they're becoming less frequent. And if the meetings are less frequent, there's less alarm and panic around. And there is, I think, a sense of stability at last after what's been a pretty tough time. I mean, if I told you that around mid to late January, there was a very real sense that the critical care capacity may completely collapse. It was very, very, very near the margin. And we were really, really near, I think, the margin for the management of cancer in time. In late February, in late January, early February. Fortunately, we got through it, and now we are looking at a bit of stability and some planned surgery.
And let's talk about the vaccine now. Nearly 15% of health service workers in England remain unvaccinated. How concerned are you that there are frontline staff who are refusing the vaccine?
Well, I'm very concerned. Of course, there are the arguments that say we don't yet know whether the vaccine definitely does prevent transmission. If we definitely knew that, it would make the case even stronger for vaccination. Part of the problem with hospitals is they're little incubation sites for the virus in a way. Staff meeting together in staff rooms after operations, on the wards, and so on. These special circumstances in which our staff can give the virus to each other that means there aren't enough staff around to do the things we really need to do. One of the big problems during the second wave was lots of families having to self-isolate, and that included our theatre staff and sometimes our surgical staff. If you've got fewer staff around, then you can't restore capacity. So I personally feel very strongly that we need to be vaccinated if we're working on the front line. But of course, I know there's a difference between volunteering and being made to have the vaccine. And in our discussions, we talk about deployment as opposed to employment, as in, if you are unhappy to have the vaccine, then you might be deployed to a part of the health service where you're, if you like, the consequence of not being vaccinated and perhaps getting COVID are less severe than if you actually have it and you're on the front line.
Professor Neil Mortensen, President of the Royal College of Surgeons. We've covered a lot of ground there. Really interesting to talk to you. Thank you for your time.